Trying to stay in shape, coordination. Uh, it is great to see all the kids up here. And I do want to start out. I say Happy Father's Day like everyone else. It's a time to think about that. But as a minister, I think there's an aspect of Father's Day that we need to consider that we maybe don't talk about very often. My father made some mistakes. And I've shared some of those with my children. And my children's reaction on occasion was, wow, how could you forgive something like that? And I said, it's easy. Because I'm going to need you to forgive me. That's just part of the deal. And if you haven't forgiven someone, maybe your father, maybe your mother, maybe a sister, a sibling, close friend, I got to tell you, that's not Christian. The Bible's very clear: if we do not forgive others, our Father in heaven will not forgive us. And then if you know anything about relationships, they will not succeed, they will not endure if there's not a lot of forgiveness. And so I just want to throw that into the Father's Day celebration. We need to continue to forgive so that we can be forgiven, and so that God will bless our relationships as we go through this life. We've come to the end of Genesis. And every time, I appreciate Tina was over here. When I get to I love reading books. I read a lot of novels, and there's always that thing. You get to the end, you want to know the end, you want to read it, but there's this, I just don't know what to do with myself after I finish a book. What's next? You got to figure it out. You had the book, you were just good, you were on track, and preaching's the same way. I get to the end of Genesis, and I've got this, it's been great. I have really enjoyed this. It's been very challenging, spiritually refreshing to me. But I just, I'm like, oh, man, I'm at the end of the book. And we figured out where we're going to go from here. But let's enjoy this last lesson from Genesis for a while. And as I've called it, you'll see at the end, but I've called it the end of the beginning. For those of you who don't know, Genesis simply means the beginning, or in the beginning. And so it's sort of, you kind of have this oxymoron of ending the beginning. Let's go through it. I don't know where Al finds these pictures. But he has done a great job on all of these things. Joseph threw himself upon his father and wept over him. The last week we read about Jacob dying, and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. You always wonder how they got the body to last that long, to get it embalmed, but I don't know how they managed that. And the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, if I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, and then I will return. Pharaoh said, go up and bury your father, as he made you swear to do. It must have been quite the proceeding. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompanied him, dignitaries of his court and all the dignitaries of Egypt, beside all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and herds were left in Goshen. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad near Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed 7-day period of mourning for his father. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. And that is why the place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. It was interesting, I've read this many times, and I've never actually looked up what does Abel Mizraim mean. And it wasn't until I actually went to Africa that I caught on. In Hebrew and in Arabic, Mizraim is Egypt. Mizri. And because it's Arabic and Hebrew, it came into Swahili. And so even in Swahili, if you want to talk about Egypt, you have to talk about Mizri. And this is the mourning of the Egyptians, the mourning of the Egyptians. And you can imagine you're a Canaanite. They've got small city-states. They've got a few little villages. But this huge Egyptian entourage comes pouring in. It must have left quite the impression on the locals. So Jacob's sons did as he commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite, along with the field. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. This is that place in the movie where you hear, Jun, Jun, Jun. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. Now, by all records, he didn't do that. But that's what they said. Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. And now listen to the wording. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. It didn't say, please forgive your brothers. Forgive the servants of God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended me harm, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done in the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Not what they expected. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land of the promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, or God will visit you. There's a thing in the text there, but come to your aid. God will visit you. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt, but he was not buried, which is interesting. That he specifically said, put my body in a coffin, but don't put me in the ground or put me in a tomb. He was kept, basically on storage, until they went up out of Egypt, which is an interesting way for him to die. But let's back up to the royal burial. You know, Jacob dies, he's treated like one of the pharaohs. And I don't think that's an accident. I mean, this is God choosing his patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is getting things started. This is the people of God. And so the idea that he would set them up to a place where when Jacob is buried, he is buried as if he were a king. He is embalmed, he is put in a sarcophagus, he is taken back to Canaan as he made them swear to be buried in that field. You remember the story when Abraham buys the field and they start arguing about, oh, it'd only be worth this much, but that's nothing between us. But it was actually a very substantial sum, and the fact that Abraham paid so much for it meant that everyone remembered it was his. And so Jacob says, I want to go back, bury me there, because that's where we're going to end up. So Joseph keeps his oath to Jacob and takes him back to Canaan for his burial. Jacob will call his children from Israel, even though they're still in Egypt. And it must have been quite a sting. I mean, you can imagine, if you're just one of the locals and you see this large Egyptian entourage, at first it must have seemed like an army of some type. They were probably quite afraid. They probably cleared the path. They all went inside their cities and locked the gates. They didn't know what was going on. And the Egyptians showed up, and to them it was all Egyptians. There were quite a few Hebrews in there, but all they saw were the Egyptian chariots and the Egyptian dignitaries. And they said, when the Canaanites saw it, mourning at the threshold, the Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning. To them, it was an Egyptian thing. But the fact that they were there meant it wasn't an Egyptian thing. And that's why they call this place Abel Mizraim. This is where the Egyptians came to mourn. It must have been a confusing story with all sorts of legends cropping up around it all through the years. But then we deal with this. You ever done something like this? Committed a wrong and hoped no one would find out? And then maybe they did find out and you were waiting for the retaliation of some kind. When Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong he did to him? Now that's not a bizarre thought. You remember Esau's threat to Jacob. As soon as my father dies, I'm going to get him back for all the things he did. And this story comes down through the ages. Some of you maybe remember the Godfather series, where the brother, commits this terrible atrocity, and the mother pleads to the Godfather, her son, saying, I don't want to lose my other son. And so he tells the bodyguard, he said, as long as my mother's alive, make sure nothing happens to him. Of course, the day after she died, he killed her. This kind of thinking, is just sort of human nature. And it wasn't unusual for his brothers to sort of say, okay, Joseph's been nice to us while Jacob was alive, but maybe as soon as Dad dies, it's going to be time to get even. And he was certainly in a position to do so. I mean, they thought he might be treating them just like they would treat him or had treated him. And you might say, well, hey, they were in Canaan. Why didn't they just take off? Well, you might remember that verse that all of the kids and their flocks and everything else stayed in Egypt. Joseph still had control of their families. And so there was no escaping coming. And what a long trip back. That whole time they went and buried their father. Out of respect to their father, they didn't say anything, but they had to go all the way back to Egypt, just sort of wondering. And I also wonder if maybe that wasn't punishment enough. And the few times that I've experienced that kind of guilt, and always wondering if you're going to get caught or if there's going to be some sort of retaliation, you torture yourself way worse than, you remember those times where, boy, you wait till your father gets home. Boy, just all day long, the anticipation, you can just see yourself, chained to the walls and being beaten and just all those things. Your dad comes home and says, look, I'm disappointed, but I don't want you to do it again, but we all make mistakes, just try to. I was worried, I even put books in my pants, just to, and nothing, nothing happened. It was, I had tortured, I had punished myself way worse than he did. And I think that's what's going on here. They're definitely punishing themselves. Way beyond anything Joseph had in mind. They couldn't take off. He had their families hostage, so to speak. So they sent word to Joseph, your father has left these instructions, and we read that before. This is what your brothers, forgive your brothers, forgive the wrongs of their servants of God. And I love this phrase. It says, when the message came to Joseph, he wept. Why do you think he wept? Why would he cry? Some might think he'd be, glad they're worried. Why do you think Joseph cried when he got this message?
Probably a lot of emotions kicking in just from all that happened.
Anyone else? He'd already forgiven. I think he had forgotten about it. And he didn't know that they were worried. I really think he'd sort of said, don't worry about it. He'd already confronted them. They'd already worked through this. He'd already discovered that his brother was being taken care of, that they'd had a change of heart, that they'd been transformed. I think Joseph had forgiven them, recognized God's plan, and completely forgot about it. And here they were in Egypt another 11, 12, 15 years before Jacob dies. And when Joseph gets this message, he realizes they've never forgiven themselves. And they've been living in fear for those 15 years. And now that their father has died, the fear had reached, its epic point. And when he finally gets this message and realizes, oh my gosh, they still think he'd forgiven them. I think that's why he cried. You see, the brothers knew what justice would demand. They knew what they had coming to them. They didn't understand mercy or grace, which seems strange for the people following Yahweh. They must have lived in abject fear, just sort of anticipating what might happen. And if you've ever been in that place for even just a little while, you know it's a terrible place to live. It's an awful place to wonder when's the other shoe going to drop? When's the retaliation? When is justice going to finally catch up with me? It's not a good place to be. It's also the issue of projection. They sort of expected to be treated the way they had been treated. I mean, that would be justice, right? But that's not what God teaches us. He doesn't say treat others the way they treat you. He says do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And Joseph seems to be catching on to this. You see, the brothers were playing by the rules of the world, the rules of the Godfather, the rules of human nature that says an eye for an eye. There's got to be, if there's an injury has been done, then another injury has to take place. They were operating off those rules. But Joseph had figured out those are the wrong rules, wrong assumptions about life. That's not the way to really live. You ever been bitter? You ever hated someone? Because this is something I learned the hard way. When someone hurts you to a point where you become bitter, when someone creates a feeling inside of you, and that someone's you, not someone else, they can do whatever they do, you make a decision. And when that bitterness reaches a certain point, this is what I discovered, is that you may think your bitterness is directed at this person, but that bitterness poisons every other relationship you have. You start to become suspicious of everyone because of the actions of one person. You start to distrust. You start to sort of think everything that is said has some other meaning, that someone's setting you up. You feel betrayed by one, you feel betrayed by all. And living with that kind of bitterness will kill you. I mean, the doctors will tell you that the connection between the emotional, the spiritual, and the physical is a lot closer than we think it is. And that if you're worried or you hate or you have bitterness, that will affect your health, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And his brothers were playing by those rules, and they were expecting to be treated. But he said, don't be afraid. And I love the way he puts it. Am I in the place of God? Think about that. Am I in the place of God? See, they were expecting revenge. They were expecting justice. And Joseph says, am I in the place of God? Because vengeance is mine, says the Lord. God is the one who will mete out the justice and the grace. God is the one who will see to it that those who need punishing will be punished and that those who get mercy will get mercy. Joseph recognized, I'm not God. And you think that's a really, duh. The fact of the matter is that's the original sin. Right from the Garden of Eden that started this book, man has wanted to put himself in the place of God. Man has wanted to write his own rules. Man has wanted to be his own judge. And Joseph realized, no, I'm not in the place of God. He's God. I'm not. And I'm going to let God take care of you. You might think, well, that was nice of him. Well, it could have been. I think it was. But the fact of the matter is, when you say, you know what, I'm not going to seek revenge, I'm going to let God take care of it, believe me, God will take care of it much better than you could. One way or the other. And if grace is given, then grace is given greatly. And if punishment is given greatly. But God knows way better than you do how to handle it, how to get revenge, how to get justice. We get emotional, we get foolish, we become irrational. It's so much better. And you will live a more peaceful, healthy life if you leave those things to God. Recognize, am I in the place of God? No, I'm not. So don't be afraid. You intended me harm, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives. That's what God is all about. So don't be afraid. Not only am I not going to kill you, I'm going to continue to take care of you and your children. Put yourself in one of the brothers' positions when you heard this message. Not what you were expecting, but a very clear glimpse of the grace of God. You see, God's good plan trumps the world's evil plan every time. And that even when the world thinks he's got it all worked out, it doesn't work out. Because God wins every time. Say, well, Joseph suffered a lot to save all those lives. That's a common story in Scripture. The righteous will suffer. We read about Job. We read about Joseph. I was thinking of the story of David. Samuel shows up when David's a teenager and says, you're going to be the next king. And you think, what better news could a 13-year-old get? And he spends the next 20 years running for his life from Saul, who's trying to kill him. But he does become king because that was God's plan. Read in Psalms, the Lord foils the plans of nations, and he thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. When I look at our own political situation right now, I take great comfort in this verse. God wins, no matter what everybody else is doing. Paul writes, you, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, my faith, love, endurance. It's all sounding pretty good up to this point. Persecutions, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra, the persecutions I endured. Yet the Lord rescued me from all of them. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. I checked the Greek. It doesn't say might be persecuted. It says will be persecuted. While evil men and impostors will go from bad to worse, deceiving and being deceived. Shouldn't surprise any of us when some suffering and persecution come along. Now, where's the gospel in this story? Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up to this land, the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is the first time that phrase appears, and it will appear many, many times after. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid. God will surely visit you. I prefer the translation visit, but come to your aid isn't bad. God will surely come and help you. God will be with you. And then you must carry my bones up from this place. I think it's interesting. Jacob says, bury me back in Canaan. I want all the Israelites to know that's home. You are in Egypt, but you're not of Egypt. Well, Joseph, he's kind of gone native. I mean, he's running the land. He's wearing Egyptian clothes. But he still lets them know, okay, I'll be embalmed here, but when you leave as a people, when our nation walks out of here, you make sure you take me with you. And for those of you who've read into Exodus, you know that's exactly what they do. They take Joseph's bones out when Moses leads them out. He points them to the future. And you need to understand, you got to get a picture of God's timing here. When he says that God's going to visit you and God's going to take you home and take me home with you, he's talking about 450 years from now. We don't even think in those terms. When was the last time you said, you saw someone building a house saying, I want this to be here in 500 years. They sort of deliberately build our houses to fall apart. I mean, if you've had a house that's 50 years or older, like the one I have, things just keep breaking. Hot water pipes burst up through the slab of the concrete. I had a major branches and roots growing into my sewage drainage system last week. Don't worry, nothing $1,400 couldn't take care of it. Things like that just start breaking down. And Joseph's telling them it's going to happen. You're going to start to wonder. You're going to question. After maybe the first couple hundred years, you might think it's not going to happen. But the day will come. God will visit you. And when he visits, there's going to be a new Genesis. There's going to be a new beginning. And that's what I think he's telling them. That's why I like the fact that when God visits, new things happen. New creations happen, as we read in the New Testament. His dying words, he points the Israelites back to the promise and the promised land. This isn't, we live here and you're going to be here for a long time and it's going to be easy to forget, but I don't want you to forget. This is temporary. And I know 450 years doesn't sound too temporary to you, but it's temporary. And the day will come and God will visit and there will be a new beginning. Because when God comes to your aid, new Genesis take place all the time. New beginnings, no matter how messed up things have gotten. And I really need you to understand that. I've talked to so many people who seem to have, we read about the unforgivable sin. And the fact is, no one really knows what that is. But I've had people come in and think they've committed it in some way, shape, or form. That they think maybe it's just the accumulation of so many sins that makes it unforgivable. And they have this idea that God can't forgive them. And I think God weeps. You see, when you come to God with that message, I've done so much, I've messed up so much, I don't think you can forgive me. I think he's just like Joseph and says, you didn't get the message. You missed the memo. I sacrificed my son. The blood of Jesus covers it. You don't have to live in fear. You don't have to live in guilt. that when you come to God and when God visits, it's a new beginning. And you become a new creation. I was thinking, there's always hope. And we need to keep that in mind. As I got to the end of the beginning, I thought of, some of you know I'm a Winston Churchill fan. I love reading all of his biographies and anything about him. There's a reason Zach's middle name is Winston. That I've always had a fondness for Winston Churchill, but one of the quotes as I got to the end of this, at the end of the Battle of Britain, those of you who are familiar with World War II, America hadn't entered the war yet. The Germans were about to invade Britain, but they needed air superiority, and amazingly, I think the British had 600 planes to the Germans 1,500, and the British managed to fight off and destroy any chance of the Germans attacking. And so Winston Churchill came on to the radio and told the British people, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. But it may well be the end of the beginning. And what he was letting them know was, it's not over. We're still in it. And it's going to be a long fight. We're going to have to persevere, but we did stop them from invading our country. Now the next task is to go back and take back what they've taken in Europe. And when Joseph ends here, he's letting them know this is the end, but it's not the end. When God visits, take my bones back to Israel, because this is not the end. It might be the end of the beginning, but it's not the end of the story. Because with God, new beginnings are always possible. If you need God to visit you, and you need a new beginning in your life, well, we'd love to help you in that process. You can come and talk to any of the elders anytime. I am available. My office hours are 9 to 1 o'clock, Monday through Thursday. If you need a new beginning, if you need a God visit, please let us know. And please keep all those who are struggling in our prayers as well. I know Bill and Patty Henniger are very close to my heart right now. We need to keep them in prayer and just lift them up before God as well. But whatever your needs may be, please come as we stand and sing.